Welcome to Mindful Monday. My name is Allison Knight, and I am the health coach for Employee Health Center. We've been talking about seeing thoughts as thoughts, talking about how we create meaning out of scraps of information that we receive with our senses, but they aren't necessarily fact. And so the whole idea of this mindfulness practice is that we're trying to create a new relationship with our thoughts in order to view them as mental events and not necessarily as the truth. From there, we talked about our top 10 most unhelpful thoughts. I asked you to create a list, and so this was for you to personally identify your thoughts that are negative and not helpful, and be able to start to find a pattern that we can think of the next time we realize we're having so many of these thoughts, so we can set up a relapse signature or an early warning sign. We also talked about implementing the 3-minute breathing space as a responsive focus on our thoughts and being able to view those thoughts kind of like on a movie screen. We see them and they pass by, or as clouds in the sky, or we take it a step further and focus specifically on those thoughts and especially on the body sensations we might feel, to determine the underlying emotions and feelings that are actually causing those negative thoughts. We want to look at those patterns of unhelpful thoughts, and then we also want to look at those signs and triggers that we have, such as eating too much, not enough eating, sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, becoming more irritable, and creating our own personal relapse signature, so that when we start seeing these things happen, we can identify that we're starting to spiral downwards. It's also helpful to share this with a spouse, a loved one, a significant other, a child, a coworker, a friend, so that they also know that this is your signature and they can step in and help you when they start to see this pattern happen as well. Last week we started talking about kindness in action, and I asked you to create a list of activities that you have to do daily, weekly, and I wanted you to break it down further. Rather than just going to work, checking email, making phone calls, going to meetings, etc., and same with housework. Well, what specifically? Folding the laundry, making dinner, washing dishes, etc. And after you created this list, I wanted you to determine whether this activity nourished you and energized you, or depleted you and drained you. So you created an N, or you created a list, and then you put an N or a D next to it. What this activity showed us is that what you do affects how you feel. And more importantly, changing what we do can change how we feel. So from here, we created another set of lists. We looked at pleasure and mastery activities. So a pleasure activity is something that gives you a sense of joy or pleasure when you do it. Whereas a mastery activity is something that doesn't necessarily cause you joy while you're doing it, but it causes a sense of accomplishment, and something is different once you've done it. The thing to note is that, especially in depression, it's often hard to find as much joy, and so generally sticking more towards the pleasure activities in that regards might be helpful, but mastery activities are still important. So I had you create 2 separate lists of pleasure activities and list of mastery activities, so that you have this on hand and you're able to look at it when you need it. The thing that we want to talk about, however, is that in depression, motivation actually works backwards. You actually need to do something before you're able to want to do it, or you're probably not going to do it. And so if it's possible for you, try to make yourself do that activity and then discover how you feel after doing it. Because resting and not doing anything can actually increase that fatigue and tiredness that you're feeling. This is true when you're not depressed. If you've laid around all day, you might have noticed that you're actually tired because you didn't do anything all day. But that's perpetuated when we are in a state of depression. And so making yourself do something and staying in the game can actually help you get out of it. The other thing we want to talk about is that kindness heals and unkindness hinders your progress. So I'm going to read 2 separate scenarios, and we'll discuss them afterwards. The first scenario is about Tom. Last night I got home, and as I stepped through the door into my empty apartment, a wave of sadness and weariness swept over me. I could feel my mood sinking fast. Then I recalled that activity is a way to get rid of depression. I thought of my list of M and P activities, mastery and pleasure, and chose listening to my favorite music as the one most likely to shift my mood. I put on the music and settled down to listen, but as I listened, I found myself wondering, is it working? Is the sadness going away yet? And I found myself focusing on my mood rather than the music. I had to keep forcing my attention back to the music, but then I was irritated with myself and frustrated that the music wasn't working. In the end, I just had to call it quits. If anything, I felt worse rather than better, and that left me with a sense of dissatisfaction that lasted the whole evening. I was glad to get to bed and blank it all out. Scenario 2 comes from Jim. Last night I got home, and as I stepped through the door into my empty apartment, a wave of sadness and weariness overswept me. I could feel my mood sinking fast. Then I recalled that activity is a way to look after myself. I thought of my list of M and P activities and asked myself, how best can I take care of myself right now? I chose listening to my favorite music as a way to treat myself kindly, to give myself a little treat in the moment. I put on the music, made myself physically comfortable, and settled down to listen. My mind drifted away from time to time, but as best I could, I treated myself gently. I could feel the relief in my mind and body as they sensed they were getting some kindly attention at last. Thoughts of other ways in which I could take it easy that evening came to mind. When the music stopped, I noticed the sadness and weariness had lifted a little. I puttered about the rest of the evening quite pleasantly until it was time for bed. So similar scenarios, but we found that the negative aversive intention of getting rid of sadness and that sinking mood fueled more aversion and unpleasant feelings. So again, that negative mindset is connected with negative feelings and thoughts. Whereas Jim took a positive, kindly intention outlook where he was taking care of himself when he felt sad and low, which enabled healing to occur and prevented him from getting stuck in that negative feedback loop. So instead of trying to get rid of those feelings and focusing on the sadness or the anger or the frustration, see if it's possible to engage in the mastery or pleasure activities as an act of kindness to yourself, and ask yourself, what can I do to best take care of myself right now? Now, you might have thoughts that stand in your way. There are things in life over which you don't have a choice, like going to work. I wasn't raised to take time for myself. I'm balancing being a mom, a career woman, a wife, and a housekeeper. Where do I find the time for myself? And this is when those themes of hopelessness coupled with guilt about taking time for yourself will likely undermine your motivation. But it is important to take care of yourself because you can't pour from an empty cup. You're not going to be very much good to anybody if you're not taking care of yourself. So I'm going to read another little excerpt. Jackie was a nurse on a busy hospital ward, always, as she said, being knocked off her feet with one thing after another. There simply seemed to be no time for her to relax, far less to sit and meditate. But she started to pay more attention within the busyness. She noticed that little spaces opened up even at the most hectic times. She said, for example, that she had needed to phone someone in another part of the hospital to get some test results on a patient. She phoned several times but got no reply. This was one of the most frustrating aspects of her job, waiting for someone in another department to answer the phone when she had so much to do. She started to get angry and to criticize herself for getting frustrated so easily. Then she stopped. Here was 30 seconds in which she could not rush around. Here was a moment of potential silence in the noise of the day. She started to use the lack of an answer as an opportunity to use a breathing space, to step back. Gradually, she started to notice other times when she could take a step back. For example, pushing the medication cart, which limited the pace of her movement along the corridor, or walking to the other end of the ward to see a patient's family. Prior to this, she had thought that meditation practice might be best done when taking a lunch break or going to the restroom. Now she found she could look for the in-between spaces throughout the day, spaces that transformed her thoughts, feelings, and behaviors for the rest of the activities during the day. So what mindfulness practice has brought Jackie is being able to turn inward rather than escape or avoid her experience, and seeing her thoughts as thoughts, and to find the spaces in the busyness where she could find time for herself, even within her hectic and demanding life. And this is important to note because we all have a hectic and demanding life. We're all trying to balance one thing or another, and it's important to note that we do have spaces, even if it's 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes, to take a minute for ourselves, take a breathing space, do some quick meditation, a mindful walk, a body scan, to determine your mood and be able to influence your thoughts and hopefully emotions, at least briefly, if not throughout the rest of the day. Now, we're coming to the close of our mindfulness practice, but we want to talk about how do we sustain this? How do we continue mindfulness practice in our day-to-day life for the rest of our lives? And we will start talking about how do we create a sustainable mindfulness practice next week. Hopefully you can take some time to find that 30 seconds this week in your day, multiple times a day, where you can take a step back, you can reevaluate, give yourself a moment to breathe and relax. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next week. I hope that you have a wonderful and mindful Monday.